Hi everyone, I'm excited to announce that the 8-week online Transcend course is back. Become certified in learning the latest science of human potential and learn how to live a more fulfilling, meaningful, creative, and self-actualized life. The new cohort starts on June 25th and will include more than 10 hours of recorded lectures, live group Q&A sessions with me, small group sessions with our world-class faculty, a plethora of resources and articles to support your learning, and an exclusive workbook of growth challenges that will help you overcome your deepest fears and grow as a whole person. There are even some personalized self-actualization coaching spots available with our world-class faculty as an add-on. I'm happy to announce that just for Psychology Podcast listeners, you can get 20% off the course by going to transcendcourse.com and entering Psych Podcast in the coupon box. We will be closing registration soon, so I suggest signing up as soon as possible. We have so much fun in this course, and you will receive a lot of support along your self-actualization journey. Just go to transcendcourse.com to register and enter PSYCHPODCAST, Psych Podcast, in the coupon box. I look forward to welcoming you to the Transcender community.
The errors in not fully appreciating how my future self's interests may be different from the ones I have right now. And that's another version of really being mean to our future selves, or at least not that kind.
Wow, what an amazing concept. Hello, and welcome to the Psychology Podcast. Today we welcome Hal Hershfield to the podcast. Hal is a professor of marketing, behavioral, decision-making, and psychology at UCLA's Anderson School of Management. The recipient of numerous teaching awards, Hal was named one of the most 40 outstanding B-School profs under 40 in the world by business education website Poets and Quants. He publishes in top academic journals and also contributes op-eds to the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, and other outlets. His latest book is called Your Future Self: How to Make Tomorrow Better Today. In this episode, I talked to Hal Hershfield about meeting your future self. Decisions are trade-offs between the present and the future. Oftentimes, it's easier to choose what feels gratifying now than to choose what's more beneficial in the years to come. Hal believes this is because we feel disconnected to our future selves. Hal shows us the mental mistakes we commit when thinking about the future. He shares with us how to visualize who we want to become so we can make choices that are better for us now and later. In this episode, we will truly help you meet your future self and feel a great connection to it. This was a really great conversation. I really respect Hal and his research. He has a lot of scientific integrity, and I also like how he is very interested in applying it to help all people reach their full potential. So without further ado, I bring you Hal Hershfield. Hal, so great to have you on the Psychology Podcast.
Hey, thank you, Scott. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy for you to be here. Such a awesome topic we're going to talk about today. Something it's been near and dear to my heart as well as yours, on the future self. But before we jump into the topic of discussion today, can you tell people a little bit about what you do at UCLA's Anderson School of Management and what sort of background you have? Because I feel like you have a psychology background.
Yeah, that's right. So I am a professor of marketing, behavioral decision-making, and psychology. Basically what that means, my background psychology, but I teach in the business school. And so for all intents and purposes, what that means is I'm really interested in the psychological underpinnings of decision-making and understanding sort of why consumers do the things that they do, why people do the things that they do, and then how we can help them do more of what they say that they want to do from a psychological lens.
Did you, when you went to grad school, were you thinking, oh, I'm definitely going to be a professor in a school of management, or were you thinking it could go any direction?
Yeah, I wish I could tell you I had this very elaborate, planned out path. Yeah. But I mean, honestly, it was a series of fortuitous events. I was on the train and at the time, my girlfriend, now my wife, had gotten an interview at Northwestern for grad school. And I ran into one of my professors and I said, I don't know what to do. And he said, you should apply to this postdoc there. It's in a business school. It's for people who do the type of research you do. I hadn't even thought about it. And I often think, had I not run into him, would I not have known about this? And I did this sort of extra training that put me into the business school world, specifically for people with psych backgrounds. And I really loved it because it let me do the research I want to do, but then also talk to like quote unquote real people out there.
Awesome. Yeah, I think a lot of people who get psychology PhDs don't realize they could make a lot more money applying to business schools for jobs. It's like, even like
and make a difference, Scott.
yeah, whatever. Even adjuncting for a business school is 10 times the salary from adjuncting. I mean, no, I think people in academia are really exploited. So this is just a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, I know. I'm with you though.
Okay, so let's talk about your future self. What got you thinking about this line of work in the first place?
So to some extent, it's like another one of these kind of happy accidents. It was like I was in grad school. It was around the time of the financial crisis. And I had been sitting down with my graduate mentor, not to make this too academic. It's really not. She said this funny thing to me. She was like, gosh, there's all these people who are in this like dire straits when it comes to their retirement. Economists always talk about this, but psychologists have nothing to say. And like, I think you should do something about retirement. And I was like, that sounds incredibly boring. And she said, that's kind of the problem that someone your age thinks that. I started to think more and more about it. And it was like, okay, retirement decision-making, long-term decision-making, it all involves this trade-off between the things I want right now and the things I want later. And economists had always thought about that in terms of how do people make trade-offs between these rewards. But I started thinking about it more deeply and looking at the philosophy. And it turns out if you want to know how people make trade-offs between rewards now and later, it may make sense to try to figure out how people think about themselves now and later. So it really got me into this mindset of understanding how do I even think about the future self and what that means. So that was kind of the impetus there.
Don't you also have a personal story about a time that your wife and you found out you were going to be parents?
Yeah. Okay.
So you want to tell that story too?
Yeah. Why don't I do that one? Okay. So, all right. So you asked me how I got into this. So
you gave me the nerdy answer.
Yeah. I'll give you the nerdy. Let me give you the fun. I'll give you the fun answer. Okay. So, all right. So several years ago, I got invited to this conference in Iceland of all places. And it's like really not all that often that I get to go to a place as cool as that for a conference, So of course I say yes. And it worked out really well with my wife's schedule. We just had to go together. She was going to be kind of like doing her own thing while I was there. And by the way, it was at the Blue Lagoon Spa. And so it's this very funny thing where there's like all these people walking around, like the hotel spa guests. And I'm in this like conference room and I'm feeling a little bored because, I'm thinking I'd rather be outside. And the first speaker gets up, L.A. Paul. She's a philosophy professor at Yale. And she gets up there and she's super cool. And she goes, imagine that you had a one-time only opportunity to become a vampire. And I'm like, oh my God, what a weird way to start a talk. And she goes on, she's like, look, all your friends are telling you it's great, that you'll love it. It's this amazing thing. But there's one catch, which is that once you become a vampire, you can't undo that decision. Like you'll always be a vampire and you can't really know what it's like until you do it. And I'm sitting there and I start having this kind of anxiety spiral because like 3 days before, my wife and I found out that she was pregnant with our first kid. And I'm sitting there and I'm hearing this thing about vampires and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is just like becoming a parent. My friends are becoming parents. They're telling me you should become a parent too, but you won't know what it's like until you actually do it. And like, as I'm having this anxiety, that L.A. Paul stops and she's like, of course, this is just an analogy to becoming a parent. But what was really interesting about this to me was that it highlighted how we can never really know our future selves. That once we go through changes in our lives, those changes will change who we are in ways that we can't anticipate. And it got me deeply fascinated in this idea of who are we going to become? How do we relate to that person? And what do those relationships mean for the decisions that we make every day?
These are such important questions. I feel like some people, like their individual differences and the extent to which people are in connection with their future self, or in connection with who, with some idea of who they want to be. And I don't know, I'm always amazed at like prodigies, or like people who really, really young are like, I want to do X. I mean, I don't mean to focus on myself, but like when I was asked in like 4th grade what I want to be when I grew up, I said I want to be a PhD academic psychologist. And so I feel like I was in connection with my future self for a long time.
Well, Scott, you know what's funny is that's when I was asked that same question, my answer was the opposite, because my parents are both psychologists, and I said I don't want to be a psychologist. That's the one thing I know I don't want to do. But of course,
that is super funny. I was trying to imagine what the exact opposite of a PhD academic psychologist would be.
Not one.
A clown.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah. So I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Seems to be individual differences in like what explains those individual differences. Like why it does seem like some people live for the moment all the time. I guess delayed discounting is relevant here as well in this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, to some extent, we all, choose now over later in various ways, right? But you're right that overall, I think there are individual differences here. I mean, a lot of what my research has been uncovering is how do different people relate to their future selves, and how are some people more connected and other people are less connected, and how those sense of connections can really impact, your likelihood to save or eat healthy or exercise, and so on and so on. But, the question of where these come from is a really deep question, and it's one we're still exploring. Of course, age is one sort of situational factor, right? So the older I get, the more connected I am to my future self, because life becomes a little more stable.
Yeah.
But even then there are differences. It's not like everybody goes, in lockstep, in sync with each other. If I have a more stable upbringing than not, that helps explain some of these differences. But then again, even still, there are differences there. And it's just kind of an open question to figure out, why is it easier for some people to relate to that future self than others? One thing I've really been exploring, and suspect maybe part of it, is, who are the models that I have, right? And am I likely to see sort of, I'll say like proxies for my future self? Am I so fortunate that I can see older people in my life that represent the person I want to become? Or do I not have that? And, and this is all speculation. It would be really nice to be able to sort of systematically examine the role that those sorts of people play in our lives.
And really, that also speaks to the importance of, for like underserved populations and school interventions, showing really inspirational examples of what a future self could look like, even though it's not maybe immediately around them where they're growing up.
100%.
Yeah, so important. I mean, the topic you study touches on so many fundamental existential issues. So an interesting question is like, are we the same over time? Like how much do we change? Personality change, these are topics I'm maybe this is selfishly I'm interested in, but it seems relevant to the work you're doing.
Yeah, it really is. I've been fascinated by these same questions too. It was funny. I started, asking this exact question, are we the same over time? And the more and more I dug in, I realized that part of the problem here is like how you even ask the question. So like, what does same mean, right. and not, not to get too sort of in the weeds here, but it turns out there's no black and white answer. Brent Roberts and Radhika Damon have done some fascinating work on these questions. One of the ways that I've come to think about it is that there are many ways that we do change over time. So, if you look at the 5, the big 5 core personality traits, in a 10-year span, you can expect to change a decent amount on one of those traits, which is kind of wild, right? You could get more conscientious or more open or less extroverted or whatever. So you look at that, on the one hand, you say, wow, one of those changes, that's crazy. And then the other way to look at it is, well, 4 of them sort of stay the same. And, that sort of suggests it goes both directions. One thing I really like, one way to look at this that I think is so telling, is to think about what's called core moral traits. So Nina Strominger, she's done some really cool work on this, and she suggests that those are the things that we point to as making us stay, quote unquote, the same over time. So, and when I say core moral traits, I mean like, are you someone who's considered kind or compassionate or sardonic or biting? These sorts of things that we say that's kind of who you are. And if I see in you that I haven't seen you in 10 years or 20 years or whatever it is, but you're still kind at the heart, or you're still sarcastic at the heart, then I say, sure, lots of circumstantial things have changed, but in some ways, at the core, you are the same. You are who you are.
Yeah, and I don't, it's how much does big 5 personality traits really tell us who you really are?
Absolutely.
It's like there's a lot of people who share the same level of openness as I do, and how does that make me so uniquely Scott Barry Kaufman?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be uniquely Scott Barry Kaufman?
Yep. I mean, I don't know. I think you asked the question exactly the right way. And I'm sure, by the way, you could do the survey. You can ask all sorts of people in your life and they would probably converge on a set of traits that go far beyond openness, right?
Yeah.
And if those changed, my bet is that people would no longer see you as the same, and that, your friends may change, your relationships may change too.
Yeah, I think so. How do I know that the future me is really me?
You don't. And I think that's confronting in a way. Even next week, I suspect I will be me, but I don't know what will happen between now and then, and I find this to be sort of existentially terrifying at times to say, like, I really can't know. I can't know what changes will happen in the world or in my friend group or in my family. And I can't know how those changes will change me. But to some extent, and that's probably why we don't think about these things all the time. To some extent, you still, or rather my sort of take on this is that you still plan. You still sort of go about doing what you're doing, recognizing that there could be some changes along the way.
Yeah. I've been thinking about the relationship between the affective forecasting literature and the work you do. And, we're so bad at knowing how we're going to feel later on if we make certain decisions. And we often also overestimate how much something will hurt, or even how much we'll enjoy something. Does that get in the way of, that over and underestimations of our emotions for the future? Does that get in the way sometimes of us really moving toward the self we really want to become?
I think it absolutely does, right? I mean, and you can think about different ways that it does, right? So, on a very sort of surface level, right? I could imagine that, like, certain financial expenses or even time expenditures, I think will make me happier in the future than they actually will, and then the future arrives and I say, why did I spend my time doing that thing? Why did I spend my money on that thing? Like, it didn't breed as much happiness as I was expecting it would. The flip side, as you mentioned, I think is also really important, which is that sometimes we overestimate the duration of the negative, it's kind of nice in a way, right? Like, nothing will be as bad as it seems, after the fact.
Nothing will be as good as it seems either.
Nothing will be as good as it seems either. And I think, in both directions, it's easy to think how those kind of forecasting errors could prevent us from doing the types of things that come back to sort of our core mission, the core things that we say we want to do, because we're not really fully able to step into the shoes of our future selves and see the world through their eyes and figure out, how will this decision impact me later?
Yeah. Is it because our future selves often look like strangers to us?
Yeah. So this is what a lot of the work I've been doing sort of circles around, that, in some ways, these future selves do look like strangers. I mean, we've looked at this at a variety of levels. One of my old studies does this on a neuroimaging level, where in the brain, the future self looks more like the way another person looks. What's interesting about this to me is that it's not always the case that my future self is going to be perceived as a stranger. It might be perceived as another person.
Yeah.
But the type of other person, I think, is what ends up really mattering for our decisions.
Yeah, is it the type of other person you want to become? Or is it the type of other person that it feels so alienated from who you currently are that you don't even feel hope that you'll ever get there or desire to become?
Exactly. And I think, that sort of motivational element is hugely important there, right? And so if I'm seeing that future self as if it's another person, but sort of this bleak other who I don't want to become, you could understand why you wouldn't do things today for their benefit. It's like almost doesn't make sense. But if they're seen in a more hopeful light, if they're seen as somebody who I want to take care of, the way that we think about our partners or our aging parents, our kids, our close friends, if we think of them that way, and I think that's really important, because it's not like those are people that we want to turn into, but they may be people who we care about and who we want to do things for to make their lives better. If that's how we think of our future selves, now it can become a little bit more understandable that we would do things today for their benefit.
Yeah. Well, so what are some other mental mistakes we make when thinking about the future?
Okay, so one big mistake is that we get overly anchored on the present, right? And so what I mean by that is that we get so sucked into what's happening right now that it's not as if the future suddenly arrives and it's surprising that it's there. It's just that we've put like all of our focus on right now. It's kind of like if you're teaching a classroom and you see other people, but you only look at one student the whole time. It's like, it would be understandable if everybody else, lost interest. You're not paying attention to them, right? And so, it's a little the same way. It's like, if we just look at our current self right now and fail to really consider deeply our future selves, we're going to start getting taken in by temptations today. We're going to start sort of overweighting present rewards and not, sort of making some trade-offs between now and later. Psychologists call this present bias, but the basic idea is that we just get sucked into what's happening right now, because of course this is the time period that we're living in.
What about focusing too much on your past as well? Like, this happened to me when I was 3, therefore I can't move on.
Yeah. So, there's some great work on regret and how we deal with it. One of the things I like to think about here is that there is a use case for these sorts of thoughts, right? If I think back to the past and have regrets, or I wish something went a different way, one way of dealing with that is a sort of hopeful and productive way by saying, I'm going to change the way that I'm living now to prevent that sort of thing from happening, or to go a different course in my life. So in other words, I think that's the healthy function that regret serves. The problem I think that you're speaking to is when we almost over apply that and we get so focused on the past that we're doing it in a way that doesn't allow for us to
move on
and incorporate those feelings moving forward.
Yeah. I think that happens a lot. I think that happens a lot in therapy. I don't know how much therapy is future self based versus past self focused. I mean, Martin Seligman and some colleagues have tried to create the field of prospection, and some clinical psychologists have tried to apply it a little bit, but still prospection is lacking in a lot of clinical realms.
Well, I think it is, and I think what's really interesting about that work is that prospection isn't one flavor, right? Prospection, generally speaking, is thinking ahead to the future. But there's some really interesting work suggesting you can do that in a variety of different ways. You can simulate and try to sort of imagine what the future is going to be like. You can make predictions, you can make intentions, or you can plan. And all of those are forms of thinking ahead. But I think you can quickly see how some are more, or could be more productive than others. If I'm just sort of spinning my wheels and just imagining the bad things that could happen to me, because I'm socially anxious and I'm going to a party and I'm worried about saying something dumb that I'm going to regret. That's a form of prospection, but I don't think it's going to be all that helpful. Is there a world in which I can plan and think about, okay, what will I do if I'm feeling nervous? Right. What will be something that I say? I mean, even this sounds so silly, but even like, planning conversation topics is that's a form of prospection. It's a form of planning. And people say, oh, that's taking away all the organic, authentic aspects away from the conversation. And then again, it makes for good conversations. It makes it better and it reduces some of the anxiety there.
No, I mean, if I didn't do that for my podcast, what the hell would I?
I mean, talk to. This is a great example. It's a great example.
No, it's a really good point. My advisor, one of my advisors in grad school, Jerome L. Singer, studied positive constructive daydreaming, and it was very important. I think it was a very important contribution to the psychology literature to say, well, that's daydreaming. Not all forms of daydreaming are bad. Freud thought daydreaming was regressive to the womb or something. Regression to the womb. It's like, what does that even mean, really? And I don't get it. But that some daydreaming can be ruminative and unproductive. That you made that point clearly. But some can be very positive and constructive. Yeah,
it's absolutely right. And it's funny because you think about that. The work that Singer did and that you're talking about there, and you sort of put that up against the sort of present day, mindfulness and being focused on the present. And there gets to be this real sort of tension that I don't even think should exist. Right. And because, that is the constructive daydreaming, the planfulness there. That's a way of allowing you to be present, moving forward into the future. And I wouldn't begrudge anybody that doing that. And it could be helpful, right? But is it anti-present? I don't know. I don't think so.
I don't get me started on that topic, because I've been like, so, in terms of the neuroscience, I've been arguing the mindfulness folks really neglect the value of the default mode brain network. And they focus too much on the executive attention brain network, as though like daydreams must be abolished from the kingdom, abandoned. But the resolution to that paradox is just you can be intensely mindful to your daydreams. It's like, that's it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I mean, I would put a lot of money wagering that, that would probably result in better outcomes.
Yeah. I mean, you can be intensely mindful of the outside world. Yes. You can be intensely mindful of your breath, but you can also be intensely mindful of your future goals, your aspirations, your dreams, your future self, self.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And not one of these needs to be at the cost of the other, it's like maybe literally, maybe literally in that moment you can't do all, but there's no world in which, we're saying these have to be, mutually exclusive.
Forever. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of moments where I'm so deeply absorbed in my daydreams that I forget that there is a world outside of me. That is true. Yeah. Why didn't you answer my phone call? My mom or something. Like, I was daydreaming.
That's a good impression. Hope she's okay with that.
Have you met my mom? I love her. She's the best. So what are some areas or domains where we fall short of our long-term goals?
So, I mean, there's the classic ones, right? So, we can point to undersaving and, overspending or overeating and, not doing enough healthy exercise, et cetera. But lately I've become much more interested in time expenditures and the ways that that's another form of sort of present future trade-off, where if we're not careful, we can end up dissatisfied with our choices. And so, I mean, it's easy to point to, I meant to save more and I didn't. I meant to not, like splurge on dinner this weekend, but then I got wrapped up in the moment. That's of course an example. But I think, these cases where I tell myself, I want to connect more to my friends from, going way back, or even my friends who I'm friends with now. And I can never find enough time. And then I look and I say, how much time was I just like sitting around on my phone today? How much time did I spend I was tired at night. I didn't feel like making plans or something like that. Those are the same sort of decisions where it's easy to prioritize the temptations right now and not then do the deeper work to get connected to the bigger picture that probably will result in more satisfaction, more happiness later on.
Later on, but it's so hard for us to justify later on when right now something might be hedonistic.
Well, okay, but then let me like add a wrinkle to that, right? The time expenditure is a good one where it's not like me taking the time to call my old friend will only benefit me later. It'll also benefit me right now because
that's true.
Probably going to be a good time, and why don't I do it? Well, it's going to be awkward to catch up after a while. And I'm going to have to find 30 minutes. I'm going to have to find an hour to catch up. And it's just easier to go on Instagram or something like that, right? And the reality is, we know this from the research. It's a lot better than we think it's going to be. It's not as awkward. And it's nice to do that catch up,
It's a really great point. You're often, it's not like you wake up in the morning, it's not like you want to go to the gym, but you often find after going to the gym, you're like a different person. Like you do the thing, you make the action, you become a different person.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I love that example too, because that's like today. Like, some of these things we're talking about, it's over years. Retirement, like decades, and and I wake up and I'm like, I don't want to go. And, all those days that I don't go, I know how I feel at the end of the day. I feel a little bit more, jittery or whatever. And I sort of wish I had just gone on a walk or run or whatever it is, whatever the sort of flavor of exercise we're thinking about, right? It changes you to do it.
Yeah. So why do people have such a hard time following through on their plans for their long-term goals? It must be related to the same reasons why they fall short of their long-term goals.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I think some of it boils down to getting overly anchored on right now, right? We sort of talked about this.
Yeah, we did.
There's other versions too where we convince ourselves that we're thinking ahead to the future, but we're not doing it in that deep of a way. So I think of procrastination as a great example where I tell myself I'll do something next week. It's not as if I'm not thinking ahead. Like I'm saying that's when I'll do this thing. But like if I really thought deeply about it, like, I'm not going to finally take care of that like stack of papers on the dining room table, or like I'm not finally going to like organize my kids' art projects that I've been like saying I'll do for a while. Like next week when I like am not doing it this week. But like there's other versions of this, by the way, like saying yes to things in the future that I later regret. Like that's another version of I'll think ahead to the future, not that deeply. So I think that's one of the that's like another sort of like mistake that makes it harder for us to do the things that we say we want to do. There's like one other one, which is that we sometimes make a mistake in both directions where I get overly anchored on my feelings right now and use those to project ahead. And I sort of say like, I'm making a decision for my future self, but what I'm really doing is sort of like just using today's feelings to do that. Right. So, I mean, the classic example is like, going to the grocery store and I'm right after dinner, I'm not that hungry. And I come home and during the week, I'm wondering like, where are my snacks? I should have bought more food, or, the reverse, right? I go there hungry and I get all this food that I end up throwing out. That's the sort of like classic surface level example, but like there's other versions of this, right? Like if I'm depressed, I think I will always remain this way, right? And if I have like a surge of energy, I may take on projects that are too big because I think I'll continue to have this same level of energy moving forward. And then like halfway through the project, I'm wondering like, why did I do that?
That's especially hard for people with bipolar disorder.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had to throw that wrench in there. This is a mental health podcast.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's absolutely right. Yeah.
You might be going through a manic phase where you think you can handle all this with your energy, and then you come crashing down and you realize you don't have it. In your book, you talk about a certain class of mistakes you call time travel mistakes.
Yeah.
What things fall within that category?
Right. So, when I talk about time travel, I mean, I should be careful, right? We're not really talking, obviously, I think we know we're not talking about real time travel. I'm really interested in mental time travel.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. And I know that, right? But, it's this concept I love, right? Because we are, on the one hand, we're so good at this as human beings. Like, it's wild to think about how I can like jump ahead 10 years in my mind and also think back to now. And at the same time, think back to when I was a kid, and like all of these things can happen in the span of seconds. Mm. But at the same time, we're also like, we make some mistakes, right? So in the book, I talk about 3 types of errors. So one of them I said, we miss our flight. What I mean by that is it's like you're at the airport bar and you're having a drink and you look up and realize like, oh no, my flight is left. And what that is basically that's like, again, good. Like being hyper focused on right now. Another version of this is, what I call poor trip planning, where I am, sort of thinking ahead, or I tell myself I'm thinking ahead, and I haven't really planned deeply. It's like I'm going on a trip. I land in Boston and realize like I've done nothing, and then I spend half my time there like figuring out what to do. It's kind of wasted. It's inefficient. It's not that good. And then the other time traveling error I talk about is what I call packing the wrong clothes. And this is the one where I'm using my present day feelings to project those ahead. I'm in Chicago. It's winter. I'm going to Miami. I know it's going to be warmer there, but I don't quite move away from just how cold it is in Chicago, and I end up packing a lot of stuff that I don't need. Now you could say, well, what's the error there? Well, I could have used that space for something different, but when it comes to time travel, the error is in not fully appreciating how my future self's interests may be different from the ones I have right now. And that's another version of really being mean to our future selves, or at least not that kind.
Wow, what an amazing concept, being mean to your future self. Wow. This stuff is pretty deep. Everyone ultimately wants to self-actualize in my world, in my kind of area of research, and that kind of actualization of their full potential is always a future thing that no one's ever going to actually achieve. Mm-hmm. We always get closer and closer to it. We never like precisely become that future self, right? It's always like a direction, not a destination.
I think that's exactly right. And it's where, I love the metaphor of the future self as another person, and it's where that breaks down, right? Because I never turn into another person. I never turn into my spouse or my best friend.
Yeah.
And, there's not like, I don't think there's a moment where we wake up and say, now I have become my future self. But I think the way you said it is exactly right. It's more of a path on the way to becoming that version of us that we want. One thing I think is really interesting here is some researchers have found that when we think about turning into our future selves, we incorporate the notion of positive change into similarity. What that means is, I think I can become more of, quote unquote, who I am, while at the same time changing, right? So I'm becoming more magnanimous, more open, more empathetic, more patient. Those are big changes, but I incorporate that change into like now sort of arriving at the ideal or the actualized version of me in the future. It's kind of a nice trick, a nice little psychological quirk, maybe.
Yeah. No, I like it. All we can do is make individual momentary choices that either move us in the direction of who we want to become or drastically move us in the opposite direction. And choices add up.
But that what you just said is so important, because we're really bad at seeing that math, right?
I know.
We're so good at making exceptions.
I know.
Right? And so I can I know that, I shouldn't snack as much at night as I know. Do. Trust right. Me. And it's like, but like every night I can come up with a really good excuse why tonight is the night that I should Uber Eats some froyo.
Me too.
We probably do it from the same place. And it's, it's really fascinating to me because we don't see how all of those things add up in a way because we're not like forced to, like if I order the large froyo tonight, it's not as if tomorrow I suddenly wake up looking different or feeling wildly different.
Yeah, but do it 7 days in a row and
Boom.
you actually will.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true.
Yeah, anyway, that one hit. That one hit close to home.
It resonates.
So, on a more positive note, what are some of the solutions people can do to implement to do better?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you asked that because I am ultimately hopeful about this stuff. I'm ultimately optimistic, and I know you know that, and I know that you are too. But I've thought about it in terms of 3 buckets. So one of them is making the future self more emotionally close to who we are now, to try to figure that out. The gist there is, well, you can kind of steal from what charities do really well. Charities make charity recipients more vivid. They tell a story, they show a picture, and so
they sure do.
And they do it really well. I mean, it's not always perfect, but it's like they know that that's so much better than, a paragraph of statistics, right? And so, I mean, you think about some of these things that we use to try to motivate people, like, financial advisors, they show you that compound interest chart and they think that's emotional. And it's like, it's not. Most people don't really care about that.
They do that. They love that shit.
They do. And they think that's emotional, but not everybody else does, And so we've played with different ideas. We've literally used age progression and we've shown people what they look like. And actually just a week or two ago, a company in Europe asked people to upload a photo of themselves and then write down what an ideal day in their retirement looks like. And so this woman writes, I'll be running through a field of poppies with my 3 dogs. and like, then they use AI tools and like suddenly in seconds, you have this like beautiful picture of this woman with like 3 golden retrievers and this field of purple flowers, Yeah. But like, that's not like the only solution, right? So, I mean, there's also ways to try to make the future self more vivid by, one of the techniques I like is by writing a letter to and then from your future self, which is so nice because it forces you to really step into the shoes of that future person. So that's one big bucket, right? Make the future self closer. Another one is to, almost stop for a second and recognize that all of these back and forths, all of these present future things, the person who's making all of the sacrifices is the present self. That's like kind of a bad relationship. Where like, imagine you're in a relationship, like you're the one who's always sacrificing.
Right. Great point.
You'd be like, you know what? It's time to live for me right now, And so, so one thing that, I've been really excited about exploring is, what are the ways that we can almost turn the dial down on how painful those sacrifices feel and almost reframe things, right? So how can I make that present day sacrifice not feel so bad? How can I like connect it to the bigger picture? Or how can my like one research example that I love, we asked people if they wanted to sign up for a savings account that was either $150 a month or $5 a day. And it's the same amount of money, but $5 a day, it just feels easier. Like most people can say, like not most, but a lot of people can say, there's something I'll give up for $5 a day. That dials, the notch down on the psychological pain, and people are wildly more likely to sign up for that account when it's framed as $5 a day. They're 4 times as likely to sign up. So we've been trying to explore, like, what are some other ways that we can make the present sacrifices feel easier to undertake? And then I'll say the third bucket is to recognize that despite my best intentions, I'll probably screw up. Right. So, we're having this conversation today about how I don't want to snack tonight. And like, I know I'm going to get home and it's been a long day and I'm going to like open up the pantry and I'm going to see the like leftover candy and be like, And so one thing that I've really come to appreciate is commitment devices, ways that I can try to put the, almost the like guardrails on to make sure I don't screw up when faced with temptation. These have been around for a long time, but what I've become deeply interested in is what are the ways that we can try to motivate people to take on commitment devices? Because it turns out they're really effective once they're adopted, but they're not adopted that much because people don't want to do something that could put them in trouble later on, right? So how do we change that messaging? What parts of the experience do we get people to think about? And that's an ongoing question that I'm currently exploring right now.
Well, I see why you're in a marketing school. That those are questions a lot of marketers ask as well.
Yeah, they really are. I mean, it's funny. I as a quick preview, where this is really preliminary, but this is work with one of my graduate students, Megan Weber. I went in thinking if you get people to consider the pain, how bad they'll feel if they go off course, that'll help them sign up, for a commitment device. Instead, what we're finding is when you get people to think about how good they'll feel for following through, that ends up,
I love that,
moving the needle. And it's really nice in a way, because it's like, from a marketing standpoint too, it's like, you don't want to make people feel bad, So this is really preliminary, but it's something I'm excited about exploring.
I think that's really profound and true. People feel good when they, their self-esteem increases. If you can meddle into their self-esteem a little bit, competence and self-worth are two major dimensions of self-esteem, right? And if you can make them feel more competent by letting them think they've made some decision where they've taken control of their life, you absolutely can affect that in some sort of like a prize, like congrats, Apple does that with the fitness app. You've earned the trophy for 10,000 steps. It's a trophy. Who gives a fuck about a virtual trophy?
Imaginary
from
trophy.
From Apple.
Yeah, exactly. Did you give me any of your money? No. Oh, but I did get 3 rings that went all the way around. How cool.
Why does anyone care about that? I've always wondered, but people seem to care. Or else they wouldn't. They tested it and marketed it.
Yep.
They worked with some marketer for that.
wouldn't still be a feature if they didn't care.
Yeah. But now, how do these solutions apply beyond the individual to groups? Groups, future selves of organizations, right? Imagine you're working at an organization and you're trying to motivate everyone to be like, look, everyone, this is the future of this organization. If we work hard at this, that seems very relevant too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think, I want to be careful about not, saying corporations are people too, but, I think, but no, I'm kidding, of course, but that is part of it, right? That an organization has its own personality. Yeah. And that means it has a current personality and ultimately a future personality. One bit of research that I think is really relevant here is that when you get CEOs or, executives to sort of do a time traveling exercise, the letters that they write end up being more vivid and more emotional and more concrete. And those are the types of things that can, help employees and help members of an organization feel more committed moving forward, right? So I think there's a lot of room to be done there, and there's a lot of work that I think really needs to be tackled. But the suggestion is a great one, but you can go beyond organizations and think about, in some ways, climate decisions and, decisions about resource allocation. These are decisions that also impact sort of current society and future society, right? And those are really tricky problems because there's a lot of current day problems that make sense to try to solve. But if I ignore the future ones, they just get worse too. So it's figuring out how do you balance that out? And what's the allocation there?
Well, it's the $1 million question for those who are environmentalists who have been trying to explain to people why it matters to think about the environment 1,000 years from now. And it's very hard for people to think in those terms. There are effective altruists are trying to solve this problem too.
Yeah, that's right. And that is, at the sort of centerpiece of that movement and long-termism. And it can be controversial because all I have to do is I don't have to look very far to see all of the problems right now. And then to say, do something now to affect people in 7 generations. I don't know,
And I think that like a point that sometimes that people make, the critics of that make, that they have a point, is there's so much uncertainty between now and then. So many things can change the models, and so I think this is going to be my last question. Isn't it really difficult to do things for our future selves when we're faced with so much existential angst and uncertainty?
It is so difficult. And I hear this all the time from, like undergrads and young people who say like,
me too.
I don't want to save. Why should I save? And they're looking at all these things, and it's
true.
I don't blame them at all. I've been thinking a lot about this. And when I was wrapping up the book, I was really sort of worried about this. I reached out to this guy, Xander Rose, who's one of the directors of the Long Now Foundation. It's one of these like long-termism foundations. And
cool name.
It's a great name. And
well, I think Xander Rose is a cool name.
That's also a cool name. It's all cool.
Yeah.
One of the things that he pointed out to me, which I hadn't fully appreciated, is like, it's not the first moment in history where people are faced with existential angst. You think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, et cetera. And, just because we're experiencing that existential angst doesn't mean that time's progression will somehow stop, right? We can't stop the future from coming just because we're worried about it, right? And so it may make sense to transfer some of our attention and resources and allocations to now rather than later because the future feels so uncertain on the one hand. On the other hand, you can easily see how not paying attention to the future will only cause some present day problems to almost mushroom out of control as the future comes. And so I think I feel like this is a really difficult problem. And one of the things I talk about in the book is, to sort of celebrate the present in a way, to live for today, because, ultimately the things we do today those are the experiences that our future selves will look back on. And I think, you consider what things you want to do and what things you don't want to do. The problem I have is when you sort of only live for today, you only weight today's experiences, and you just constantly say that. And then I think you end up in trouble later on. Right. And so,
yes. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, not I at the risk of sounding too Southern Californian about this, there's, an intentionality that I think is nice here, right? So if I'm a little more intentional about how I'm deploying my time and attention and money and experiences, I don't know, maybe that ends up being better for me now and for me later, but it requires some work. It's not the type of thing that I think is just, the snap of a fingers, we're all set.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a proposition you can vote for in the next ballot for that one.
Now, that is very Californian.
I know. Yeah, I know. Trust me. There's 497,000 propositions. I'm sure that's one. Intentionality about your future self should be a proposition on the ballot. That was an inside California joke. That's an inside California joke, but I knew you'd get it. I just want to end with kind of what comes up for me. Can I tell you what's coming up for me?
Yeah, go for it. I love it.
I think people are sometimes too obsessively focused on trying to reach their goals and reach their future self that we neglect thinking about the impact of our actions on the future selves of others and the future selves. So not just my own sort of like, or even just group futures, but literally like not every future self has to be you that you're impacting in this world. And yeah, I wish that people would also really consider the implications and consequences of their actions today for the collective good, the collective self, future self, if that's a concept that makes sense.
It makes so much sense to me. So much of the so much of the work I've done is on these sort of, individual selves, who I am now, who I'll be in 10 years.
Which is important for sure. Yeah.
Of course it is. But it's, it would be almost divorced from reality if my future self was just this, monolith, this solo entity, right? It's like, I'm hoping that I will have family and friends and colleagues and like and then beyond and beyond, like you said, that sort of collective, all of that plays into my conception of self. It plays into the groups I want to be part of. And so I love what you said, that these decisions I'm making now will impact me later, but also not just me, but others and others who I might care about and love, maybe even more than my own future self.
Yeah. It can also help us face mortality as well, knowing that there are selves that live on beyond our own selves.
I think it's a beautiful sentiment. It's something I've really been. It's something that I've found really comforting in the philosophical literature. Normally, philosophical literature is hard to get through. But,
hard, yeah.
If you sort of step back and say that the self isn't necessarily like the meat on my bones, and it's not my face and my name, but sort of like what I stand for and the values that I have, I do think it can help confront mortality, because it allows us to see how those aspects of ourselves can be continuous between our own selves over time, but also in the selves of others. One of my friends from my first academic job was at NYU. And one of my colleagues there and really good friends, Tom Mavis, unfortunately got diagnosed with stomach cancer about 2 years ago. And I had corresponded with him a little bit during this time. It was unfortunately very fast. And he actually started reading some of the philosophy, and he said that some of these older ideas from Derek Parfit, the philosopher, actually really comforted him, knowing that part of him is going to live on, and his wife and his son. And I found that didn't make it any easier for those around him, I think, but I think it probably helped him during that time.
Yeah. Well, I want to just end on that sentiment, and that's your work has far-reaching implications. And I really wish you all the best in your book tour. You're probably still, maybe have not even started it yet.
It's just starting to kick off.
Yeah, it's starting to kick off. So all the best. And I'm very grateful for you coming on my podcast today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Scott. This is such a fascinating conversation.
It sure was. And I'm sure our listeners will think so too. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com or on our YouTube page, The Psychology Podcast. We also put up some videos of some episodes on our YouTube page as well, so you'll want to check that out. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the show, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.